the act remains an act of bodily union and therefore personal union, because persons are their bodies and don't merely inhabit them, whether or not a child can come to be. So you can see, if you reflect on the history of our law, the way that children do matter to the definition of marriage, but not as operational objectives to which marriage is reduced to a mere instrumental means. Now, one might ask, is a true bodily or biological union of persons possible? Is that really unity when husband and wife come together? Or is it only really unity when their gametes, or the pronuclei, unite? And so they're unified in this new offspring of theirs. Again, the law of church and state has always said, no, the real unity is in the bodily communion of spouses, whether or not a child is conceived. The act remains the same act, no matter what comes of it. It's an act of mating, whether or not a baby comes. In fact, it's got to be that, right? That has to be true, because sometimes what determines whether a baby will be produced by the act or not are factors that come into play after the act. And you can't say the act was one kind of thing if those factors eventually come into play, but another kind of thing if they don't. So the act's got to be an act, and if it's a unifying act, it's a unifying act, whether or not the act results in procreation. That is, an act unifies by fulfilling the behavioral conditions of procreation, irrespective of whether the non-behavioral conditions obtain. Now, let's see a little more precisely how it's possible for sexual congress to unify spouses in a way that caused the makers of our law centuries ago, church and state, to decide that consummation really was central to the perfection of a marriage. Consider that for most human functions or activities, say digestion or locomotion, the organism performing the function or act is the individual human being. All of you walked into the room. Some of us are digesting a wonderful meal that Bishop Cordileone put on for us. That act of locomotion, this act of digestion, each of us is performing or did perform as a single organism. We don't have to unite organically in order to digest or to walk. We might assist a friend who's having trouble walking, but that's not an organic union. In respect of one act, however, the act of reproduction, things are dramatically different. Reproduction is a single act or function. It's like locomotion or digestion in being a unified act. But the act is not performed by an individual, but rather by a male and female as a mated pair. This is true in humans and other animals that reproduce sexually. For purposes of reproduction, the male and female partners become a biological organic unit. They form a single reproductive principle. This organic unity is achieved precisely in the reproductive behavior characteristic of the species, even in cases such as those of infertile couples in which the non-behavioral conditions of reproduction do not obtain. Properly understood then, in light of a non-dualistic account of the human person, the goodness of marriage and marital intercourse simply cannot be reduced to the status of a mere means to pleasure, feelings of closeness, or any extrinsic goal. Indeed, it cannot be legitimately treated, as some Christians have admittedly sought to treat it, as a mere means to procreation, though children are among the central purposes of marriage and help to specify its meaning as a moral reality, even for married couples who cannot have children. The norms that shape marriage, including the norms of fidelity and exclusivity, are what they are in part because of the nature of marriage as an institution oriented to a relationship, oriented to the coming to be and nurturing of children. But that doesn't mean that marriage is a mere instrumental means to the operational objective of having children, and that there's no intrinsic value in being part of the type of relationship that is uniquely apt for the coming to be of children. So marital acts actualize, consummate the unity of marriage, which includes the coming to be of children where that's possible. In consensual non-marital sex acts, then, people damage this unity, this integrity of marriage, inasmuch as the sexuality of the human person is part of the personal reality of the human being, and no mere subpersonal instrument to be instrumentalized and used to satisfy subjective wants of the conscious, the subjective wants of the conscious and desiring part of the self. The psychosomatic, the body-mind integrity of the person is another of the basic intrinsic goods of the human person. This integrity is disrupted by any sexual conduct that lacks the common good of marriage as its central specifying point. It's common good, the thing that gives it intelligibility as a human act and an aspect of human fulfillment. Where sex is sought purely for pleasure, or as a means of inducing feelings of emotional closeness or expressing them, or for some other extrinsic end, the body in its sexual dimension or aspect is treated as something it's not, namely a subpersonal, instrumental reality. This existential separation of the body and the conscious and desiring part of the self disrupts the good of acting as the dynamically unified being one truly is. So you can see that there's a very close connection between the underlying metaphysical and ontological view that supports abortion, embryo-destructive research, assisted suicide and euthanasia, and that supports the idea that sex outside of marriage is perfectly fine, any kind of consensual sex act is as good as any other, there's no problem with an act not being marital, all that matters that it's consensual. And that underlying view is a view that separates person and body, that treats the person as the conscious or emotional or desiring aspect of the self, and the body as a mere means to satisfactions, inducing satisfactions for the real person, the conscious and desiring self that merely inhabits a subpersonal body. This is the real profound basis of the conflict of worldviews. Usually it's implicit. Most people haven't thought it through philosophically. Most people couldn't articulate it philosophically. But give me a couple of minutes with a devout Christian and an Orthodox secularist. We'll talk about some issues at the surface, and then let me just ask each of them a few questions, and it will quickly be revealed that one believes that the body is part of the personal reality of the human being, and the other believes that it's not. And this will surprise some people because they think, gee, Christians must be dualists. Because after all, Christians believe that the soul is what really matters, not the body. And when you die, you know, the soul goes on. Who cares about the body? And they need to be reminded that the early Christians, those Jewish Christians of the first century, went to the mat, and in some cases to their deaths, for the doctrine of the physical resurrection of the body. Why did it matter so much? Why did it matter so much that Jesus wrote? Wouldn't it have been an easier story to sell in the Roman world that, well, Jesus' spirit is still with us. He's resurrected and with us in spirit. I mean, who cares whether this just material stuff of flesh is there? But they didn't. They told the tough story. He physically rose from the dead. We will physically rise from the dead to be complete, even in heaven, in eternity. To be the person one is to exist in a bodily state, the resurrection of the body. St. Thomas Aquinas went so far as to say that when I die, but before the resurrection on the last day, my soul is in heaven, but I am not there. Only a fragment, only a part, only a piece. Only the spiritual remains of the person is there until the person exists again by virtue of bodily resurrection. Now, did our Christian forebears invent the idea of integrity that is at the heart of Christian sexual ethics? Did they dream up the notion that sexual immorality damages this integrity? No. Christianity has had, to be sure, a very important role in promoting and enhancing our understanding of sexual morality. But in the dialogues of Plato and the teachings of Aristotle, in the writings of Plutarch and the great Roman Stoic Musonius Rufus, and of course in the Jewish tradition, one can find the core of this central important teaching about the way sex is so central to integrity and therefore so central not only to us as individuals, but to us as communities.